Afternoon, everyone. Please be seated. First up, I want to make some introductions on this glorious Shawnigan day. We've got some new students who've joined us this week. I won't ask you to stand up, but welcome to Christian from the Philippines, grade 11 Lonsdales. We've got Charlotte, grade 10, who's in Strathcona, who's joining us on an exchange, having come from Cape Town, South Africa. And we have Mr. Chancellor, who's our new teaching intern, who's going to be joining Strathcona as a member of staff. So let's give them a traditional Shawnigan welcome. So it's Remembrance Week here in Canada. This morning I'm going to give you an introduction to Remembrance Day and its significance here in Canada and at Shawnigan. For those of you unfamiliar with Remembrance Day, which officially takes place on the 11th of November each year, it's a memorial day, observed in some countries since the end of First World War in 1918 to mark the end of hostilities and to remember those who died in the line of duty. On Friday, it will be 104 years to the day since armistice was signed, and it was the end of the First World War. C.W. Lonsdale, our founder, established Shawnigan in 1916, a phoenix from the ashes of this turbulent period of history. In Canada, it focuses on remembrance for the men and women who have served and continue to serve this country during times of war, conflict, and peace, and those who have lost their lives in the service of peace at home and abroad. Shawnigan lost 45 alumni and staff in the Second World War. There's a commemorative plaque to my right that marks and honours them, and this week there are 45 white crosses in the quad to mark their sacrifice. On Friday, we will hold our annual outdoor ceremony, and the two heads of school will read the Roll of Honour. These members of the Shawnigan community served in the Canadian Air Force, Navy, and Army, and in many theatres of war, and were lost in the Atlantic, at Dunkirk and Normandy, in the Middle East, in North Africa, and over mainland Europe. William Mac McMullen was a member of the ground staff at Shawnigan from 1927 to 1939. A lieutenant in the artillery, he was killed in the raid on the French port of Dieppe in France on August the 19th, 1942. 2022 is in fact the 80th anniversary of the Dieppe raid, one of the most difficult and tragic days in Canadian history. After 9 hours of intense fighting on the French beaches, 916 Canadian soldiers were killed, many wounded, and 1,946 were taken prisoner. Mac McMullen was one Canadian who made the ultimate sacrifice at Dieppe. In spite of the failure of the mission, invaluable lessons were learnt, and they were instrumental in the success of the D-Day invasion 2 years later, and they changed the course of history. After the first hymn, Mr. Lupton will tell you about an alumnus who was killed in a war crime a few days after D-Day. We're going this morning to sing the Duxbury House hymn, I Vow to Thee, My Country. Hold it. Probably my favourite hymn. It's always good to pause and think about the meaning of each hymn. This is a hymn which captures love and loyalty to one's homeland in the first verse. The love that makes undaunted the final sacrifice. But in the second verse, it guides us, perhaps more importantly, to another country, the kingdom of heaven, whose fortress is a faithful heart. I do rather like that final couplet about heaven. And soul by soul and silently, her shining bounds increase, and her ways are ways of gentleness, and all her paths are peace. For me, Remembrance Day is both a time to honor those men and women, including civilians, who have fallen in conflicts, on whichever side, and also to remind ourselves that we must strive constantly to find those paths of peace. Please rise in silence, hymn number 3. Beautifully sung. Please be seated. Mr. Lupton.
Good afternoon, everyone. I must admit, sometimes when I sit in this chapel, I do find my attention waning from time to time. I look around at the beautiful building and the architecture. I check to make sure the joists are functioning properly. I admire the paintings. I know I should be paying more attention, but it's just straight after lunch, and it can be pretty hard sometimes. However, one of the places I do allow my gaze to travel is directly to my right here and to your left. This is the Shawnigan Honor Board. When I arrived at the school, I came from a younger school, and as a history teacher, I was fascinated by the richness of the experiences our alumni had had, particularly those who had sacrificed everything so that we can sit here cloaked in the warm blanket of security that we enjoy every day. That spring of my first year, I organized a tour to Europe, much like the one that's going this year, and one of my goals was to find some of these alumni and pay my respects to their sacrifice. Going off to war in the world wars would have been a remarkably surreal experience. Imagine being thrilled at the idea of going to war, but then before you depart, having to fill out paperwork about what's going to happen to your body should you die. I remember my great-grandfather telling me how he wrote his final will and testament days after his 18th birthday and just hours before being shipped off to Flanders with the Liverpool Pals in the First World War. He made it, but so many of his friends didn't. The horrors of the First World War gave birth to a new organization called the Imperial War Graves Commission, which was headed by the author Rudyard Kipling, of Jungle Book fame. Kipling was an ardent supporter of the war, and he was absolutely adamant that soldiers who fell in battle should be honored with gravestones replete with quotes, often biblical, should they or their family choose, allowing those who have fallen to speak from the grave for all time. Kipling provides us with the ubiquitous Remembrance Day line, "Lest we forget." It's with deep, bitter irony that he will lose his only son, Jack, at the Battle of Loos, just months after his 18th birthday in 1915. Kipling will spend the rest of his life searching for his son's body in vain. His guilt and devastation of having sent his only son to slaughter, no doubt a powerful motivator to honor his death. By the time the Second World War broke out, more personalized quotes on gravestones became more commonplace. Deeply moving lines of remembrance from heartbroken wives, parents, and newly fatherless children adorn so many of the graves in Europe. My grandfather, whose grave is in Ohlsdorf War Cemetery in Hamburg, has the simple word infinity written on his. So on our tour, I wanted to find the grave of William Ferguson, a lieutenant in the Winnipeg Riflemen, who died 2 days after landing on Juno Beach during the D-Day operations of 1944. Like many of the Canadian forces on that day, Ferguson's company pushed inland, quickly and heroically taking Nazi positions. Sadly, 2 days later, on June the 8th, he and many of his company were captured by a group of Waffen-SS, former Hitler-Jugend soldiers. Over the next hour or so, Ferguson, who negotiated and pleaded with his captors to free his company, he offered his own life in exchange. Many of his soldiers were fresh out of high school and not much older than many of you sitting in this chapel. He spent his final moments easing the fears of his comrades, right to the very end. He must have been terrified, but he never showed it. He and his fellow captives will be executed by the Nazis in what was a violation of the Geneva Convention and a war crime. He was 35 years old. He left behind a young family to mourn his death for the rest of their days. We'll never fully know his motivation for going to war and for leading his troops into the firestorm of the Second World War. But I rather think it's because he knew that to stand for something means you often have to stand up to someone. He laid down his life for his friends, his country, and for generations to come in defiance of the authoritarian, fascist, racist regime of Adolf Hitler. There are few good reasons for going to war, but stopping Nazism is one of them. Evil triumphs when good people do nothing, and each person on our honor board was going to do whatever they could to make sure that Nazism was defeated, even at the cost of their own lives. And so on a cool spring morning in the hauntingly beautiful Canadian War Cemetery in Normandy on that tour, we walked through the mist and we found the grave of Lieutenant William Ferguson, Shawnigan alumnus and hero of Canada. And we read his tombstone together, and we were stunned into silence. Only the chirping of birds and the distant waves pounding the shores of Normandy could be heard. The words that he chose to echo through eternity was the motto of the school that he had attended as a teenager, Palman qui merit ferat. None of us spoke for a long time. We were captured by our own thoughts. Remembrance is not just about thinking about what other people have done. It's also about reflecting on why they did those things and why it still matters today. It's about considering the lives that we live and how we can make changes today, right now, to make tomorrow better for people we've never met and probably will never meet. The world becomes a great place when people plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. And so as you exit chapel today into the sunlit quad and on your way to class, take a moment and reflect on what remembrance possibly means to you, and appreciate that remembrance is a verb and not a noun. For me, remembrance is about taking the time to honor the sacrifices of so many. It's about recognizing there are things that we hold dear that are worth fighting for. And it's a call to action for each of us to do our best to plant trees of hope for the future, lest we forget the enormous cost that has already been paid. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for that wonderful and deeply thoughtful address. We're going to follow Mr. Lupton with a hymn we don't often sing, but is often sung on Remembrance Day, and it really strikes at the heart of sailors and those in naval forces. It's going to be hymn number 19, and for those of us who know it, we'll sing a little bit louder so the rest of you can pick up the tune. So please rise, hymn number 19. Please be seated. Just as I was standing on the chapel steps enjoying the sunshine as you all flooded into chapel, a grade 9 student came up to me and said, listen, I've just written a poem about Remembrance Day. So I had a quick read of it, was so impressed, I said, have you got the courage to stand up in front of the whole school and deliver it? So, Marseille, Strathcona, grade 9, come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Lamont. As Mr. Lamont said, I am Marseille Hughes from Strathcona. I'm a grade 9, and I'm going to be reading the remembrance poem I wrote today. Silence. That's all they wanted. Peace. That's all they needed. The cries. 4 years of pain and conflict all came to an end. The fighting, the bravery, they did it for us. During autumn days, November 11th comes to remember the ones who fought for our country and for their loved ones. The time comes to pay our respects on the 11th month, 11th day, 11th hour. We will never forget. The red poppies we wear, red as red can be, to show we care for the ones that fought for me. These rustling leaves blowing through the trees, the wind takes off in the field of dreams. The poppies grow for us to know, the ones we remember will always show. Thank you.
It's very rare for the Rev to get stage fright there. So we have an exciting day ahead on Friday. Heads of houses, an opportunity for leadership from you. There will be sort of mini services held in-house before we come down into the quad. And heads of houses, you'll be briefed by your house directors, but you'll ask the youngest member of your house to read in Flanders Field poem by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, a Canadian medical officer. You'll have been given the roll of honor for those who fell in your house by the house director and the museum curator. We hope that you will also give a little rehearsal on how to sing O Canada, not just the English version, but the French, to recognize our bilingual status in this country. And you'll also sing your house hymn and then come on down in your number ones to quad, where we will have the ceremony there. So I look forward to seeing you all wearing your poppies with pride on Friday and doing what Shawnigan does best. Please stand. We'll let the staff lead out a little bit early to get to class. And then I'll hand over to Kyan. Arnika, if you want to release. What's the time, Wendy? 25. Perfect.